Welcome to Kitchen Table Talks. I'm your host, Stephanie Seaton. The purpose of these table talks is to have an informal chat with those who have shaped the field of bioethics and to provide information about educational opportunities for those who, like me, are interested in learning more. This is episode 6, Bioethics and Research, featuring a discussion with Nancy King and Ana Iltis. This is brought to you by Wake Forest University's Bioethics Graduate Program. We're so glad you're here. Please pull up a chair and join us. Thank you for joining me on Kitchen Table Talks today. We're going to talk about bioethics and research. So if you don't mind, you're both some familiar faces, but if you don't mind introducing yourself briefly, that would be great. Nancy, why don't we begin with you?
I'm Nancy King. I co-direct the Bioethics Graduate Program, and I have a very strong interest in research ethics. I teach a lot of research ethics to clinicians and to people in who are research administrators. I've worked with the Office for Human Research Protections, doing national and international teaching. I'm a former member of the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections, and I continue to work on its subcommittees where all the real work gets done. And I am also a member of the board of directors of the Association of Human Research Protection Programs, which actually accredits schools and medical centers that have human research protection programs and IRBs.
How do you have time during the day to even talk to me?
Well, see, the policy work is actually the fun stuff, and I'm sure Ana can reinforce that. When we actually get to do things and work with colleagues who have different disciplinary perspectives but are equally committed to research ethics, that is one of the most satisfying things about bioethics work and research ethics work.
Ana?
Great. I'm Ana Iltis, and with Nancy King, co-direct the Center for Bioethics, Health, and Society at Wake Forest, and I also teach in the Bioethics Graduate Program. And I have a strong interest, like Nancy does, in research ethics. And I will say that one of the attractions to coming to work at Wake Forest back in 2010 was to be able to work with Nancy, whose work I have always respected tremendously in research ethics. And I love having a colleague with whom I can really think about these challenging problems, and that our students get to hear sort of from multiple people who are interested in research ethics and talk together about these problems. One of my real passions in doing research ethics is, as Nancy was saying, sort of working with people from different disciplines, but I have a real passion for sort of integrating research ethics into the research process and working with people who are conducting research or designing research or even thinking about research, and to think about how the ethical issues that we think about in research really should inform everything from how we conceive of the questions that get asked, to how you're going to answer them, to how you actually conduct and implement a study, then how you respond to all the challenges that inevitably arise when you're conducting a human study, how you analyze data, how you report data, how you think about using it in the future. So that to me is the real passion, the sort of that idea of everything from beginning to end actually has an ethical component. And when you work with people who are committed to that and are interested in understanding that and in working together to make that happen, it's really rewarding. And then to be able to kind of involve students in that, often through relaying real world examples and things that are happening in the moment, and really being able to kind of bring that to life. So I love the classroom piece of that too.
Thank you. I have to say, as one of your students, the passion shows through, as it does with many of my faculty here at Wake Forest. Certainly is different than many other programs that I've been exposed to because of that and the true love of the work that you guys have. So that actually was a really great lead in to how we think about research ethics, or what we think research ethics is. You mentioned having worked with people from different backgrounds. What are some of the topics or other backgrounds that you've been exposed to that may not be as obvious to bioethics students?
Well, one of the things that I have seen over the years is how people who are experienced research subjects are integrated into the thinking of IRBs and principal investigators and studies, like Anna was beautifully describing how ethics is everywhere. There is a wonderful organization, Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, which has a big annual meeting focusing on IRB professionals and members of IRBs. And many years ago, they first started bringing in people who had been in research studies. And for a while, it was simply kind of like you heard their testimony and you couldn't say anything and you just had to simply accept it because they were representative of how it was assumed that they were representative of how all patient subjects actually thought. Gradually, it has come to be that there are people who are, say, for example, members of important committees like the Secretary's Advisory Committee, who have the role of patient advocate, but are extremely thoughtful and willing to be questioned and question others. So it's not quite the same as, oh, we can't really raise any issues to this person because we have to respect their story. It really involves much more that they, from whatever their experience is, are bringing as thorough a dimension to the discussion as anybody else. And so there's come to be an expectation that there are people who have been research subjects who can contribute in really significant ways. And that's playing out also in patient-centered outcomes research and study designs that are focusing on the issues that are important to the people who actually have the condition that's being studied, rather than just the measures that are going to give the nice results with a significant p-value. So I think that's one really important component that's just developed over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, there's a lot of people behind those journal articles that we try to publish, and it's important to recognize them as human. Definitely. Anna, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'll just pick up on this last piece about involving sort of recognizing the humanity of the human subjects, right? The human participants in research, and the role that they play in thinking about what kind of research matters and how you conduct research. So, a very interesting part of my job in the last few years has been to be involved with a community advisory board or a community advisory council that is working alongside investigators who are NIH funded on a clinical study. It's not a trial, it's an observational study, but it has really important implications for a minority community. And it has been so rewarding to be a part of that and to see how that has shaped the research and to work. I mean, I think sometimes I see my role there almost sort of translating the concerns, the priorities that we're hearing sort of from community members and saying, okay, how do those translate into the research realm? And so I think that's been a really important piece that's not sort of traditionally part of research ethics. Like when I was studying, that was not nearly as common. And today we recognize much more the importance of that. I'll just say some other interesting ways in which I've connected research ethics to my work. One of the things that I do is co-edit a journal called Narrative Inquiry in Bioethics. And we recently put together, and hopefully it will appear very soon, a collection of stories. So every issue of this journal is focused on a theme in bioethics. And then you collect first-person narratives from a particular stakeholder group. And we have issues that are focused on patients, stories from families, stories from clinicians. And we have an upcoming issue that is a double issue. It has a collection of stories on people who are IRB administrators or members who were involved in reviewing COVID-19 research and the kinds of things that they learned about overseeing research and human subjects protections programs in the COVID-19 era, and what lessons were learned. And then we have a set of stories also from people who were conducting research on COVID-19 in all different kinds of areas, including behavioral and social science researchers, and learning about their experiences and what worked. And so reading those alongside each other is incredibly revealing. And I think we learned so much about research ethics from just listening to the people who were involved, either as human participants, as people involved in overseeing, approving research, people involved in data safety monitoring, and then researchers themselves. And it was really fascinating to see those stories come together and to really draw out the messages, the lessons, the things that worked really well, the things that didn't work well, and to see the impact that has on research.
So Anna, I want to echo Stephanie's question to me and say, how do you have time to breathe with all the stuff that you do? And I think I know part of the answer, which is we get to do stuff that we think is really fun and really important.
Yeah, it's a real privilege to be able to choose to work as hard as we work, because we enjoy it.
Yeah, it's absolutely motivating if you are fine going into the office or getting on Zoom, huh? Even if they're back to back like this.
Yes.
Well, thank you for sharing. That's amazing. I know my background is experimental psychology, so research ethics has always been really important to me. And representing the people, while I wasn't working with patients, I was in several studies working with the elderly, and the IRB would question my use of them as participants. And ultimately, it's came out that what I was studying would be beneficial to the population if it was shown to be accurate. And that seemed to change the IRB's view, but also where do we draw the line on being ageist? And this goes into a lot of different ethical issues. And then working with the prison systems with serial killers was another interesting interaction. But patience in this last year particularly has been really eye-opening. Adding that bioethics piece to the research that I already was really enjoying has been fantastic. So I know that I'm a researcher at a school, and you both are faculty and etc. I'm just going to say etc. But what other vocational opportunities exist in this realm? What have your students gone on to do? What have your colleagues gone on to do?
Well, actually, a great many students spend at least some time working as IRB professionals, partly because that is a really growing field. And also partly because everything, everybody takes Anna's research ethics class, but even if you don't, you have the background to begin to apply the concepts to everything that you need to know in order to be an IRB professional. And so we have a number of students who have done quite a bit of that work, and some who are making careers of it. I think the other thing that is really going to take off relates to a point that you made about the IRB skepticism about enrolling elderly study subjects. And that is, since COVID and since the Black Lives Matter movement, there has been a great deal of attention to the need to, well, the way that it's generally talked about is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials, and even going beyond that to help design research that can address some of the underlying health disparities that we see. When the regulations were first put in place and when the Belmont report was written, there was a great deal of concern to protect what were called vulnerable subjects. And so that often amounted to the IRB asking questions like, why are you enrolling a vulnerable group like the elderly? or like children, or racial or ethnic minorities, or poor people. And what has happened now is we've begun to realize that that concern about inappropriate inclusions has to be balanced by concern about inappropriate exclusions. And so there is a lot of work going on and a lot of work to be done in the future to properly include and protect groups of potential subjects who could contribute a great deal to our understanding of issues, but who have not always been included for all kinds of both well-meaning and not so well-meaning reasons.
Yeah. I'd love to pick up on that, because that's something that I am really passionate about and really interested in, and have worked on in a number of different areas. Just this past year, the National Institutes on Aging did a 2-day program on expanding research access and research participation among older adults, and looking at some of the barriers, some of which are included, as actual inclusion and exclusion criteria in studies, but many others arise simply because people don't invite people to participate in research. And certainly we have found the same thing with African Americans and some other underrepresented groups. And it extends beyond that. I have done some work with students looking at psychiatric research on psychiatric conditions, where again, both for regular studies on cancer and heart disease and asthma and everything else, people with a mental health diagnosis often are just categorically excluded. But also in research on mental health disorders, the vast majority of people with those disorders are actually ineligible to participate in research, which dramatically undermines the extent to which those findings are valuable and applicable to the actual relevant patient community. And so it's a huge issue in research ethics. And I have been for many years talking about the importance of understanding that as a research ethics problem. It's not just a science problem. It is a science problem, but it also is an ethical problem. And the NIH has, for a long time had a policy guidelines in place to increase participation of women and minorities in research. But there's a lot of evidence that there's still a very long way to go. And it's really important to keep in mind all of these groups that end up excluded, either explicitly or sort of just by happenstance, from participation in research, and the downstream consequences that has on patients is not great. And so I think that's a really important research ethics issue that in more recent years has been better appreciated. This sort of social context of research. It's not just about the individual participants and making sure that they sign their informed consent documents and so on.
Right. Along that same line, something I didn't think about before I came to Wake Forest was the over-reliance on certain groups for research. I know that we have a situation where some of our minority community members, probably you both have run into this, are over-relied on to participate in studies, A, because they're willing, but B, because they fit this criteria that everybody's looking for, specifically when they're trying to expand the inclusion, the diversity in research trials. So definitely another piece to research ethics I didn't consider before coming to Wake Forest. So I know many are in IRB. We're telling me somebody works for the Department of Defense. We have others who work for other universities.
There also, I'll just jump in a minute here. There also are students who have gone on to, after graduating, work for companies that do research. Or working in academic medical centers kind of on the research side. So supporting research studies as well. And so some of them have used their work kind of in that direction, moving into study coordinator roles and other positions of that sort, as well as in sort of on the industry side.
That's right. I know somebody works over in Research Triangle Park, which is in the Raleigh-Durham area, not too far from Wake Forest. So we're very fortunate to have that very close. So when considering the students who have come into your classes and their varied backgrounds, is there anything you've found to be a common deficit in their knowledge about research ethics?
You know, it's a hard question to answer because it varies from person to person. But I think that one of the things that happens in research ethics, just as it does for folks who are more interested in the clinical context, is having to come to realize that informed consent and autonomy are not the be all and end all of what's going on. That research, that a robust system of oversight does a lot more than just check consent forms. You know, when I teach about the relationship between study design and ethics, no matter who's in the class, there's always somebody who goes, gee, I never really quite thought about design issues as also being ethical issues, or subject selection as being ethical issues. And there's a lot that you have to go through before you get to the point where you're even talking about informed consent. So I think that formal teaching of research ethics really broadens how students think about what the issues are, helps them to be better issue spotters than they were when they first thought that this was an interesting area to study.
I think that's absolutely right. I think people also sometimes are surprised by how much they do know. They just have to put it in the right frame, and how much they are able to, when you say, okay, let's actually talk about this problem, right? And let's keep talking about it. Okay, we've talked about informed consent, but what else? That collectively as a group, they can really come up with a lot more than I think they would necessarily give themselves credit for. And I think one thing that really people come out of research ethics and many other things in bioethics appreciating is the importance of discussion and of conversation with other people who will raise a different question, who will see it from a different point of view, and together, rather than all by themselves, they come up with a much better understanding of what the ethical issues are and what possible options, what possible solutions there might be.
Right, that goes back to making sure that you have people from different backgrounds in the room, particularly somebody there to represent your participant when you're designing your study, just like you said earlier. And of course, we hear about the atrocities that inform our current ethics or inform our current ethical standards when it comes to research. But we have to think back to what happened before that to cause this breakdown, to allow these atrocities to happen, and how to make up in any way we can for those atrocities. Can they ever be repaid?
Right, but because there are things that you cannot make up for.
Right.
But there are ways in which you can commit to never doing those things again. And that importance of the understanding of the historical context and also the systems pieces. You know, one of the questions that I often ask whenever I'm teaching about any sort of ethical disaster is, who was in a position to prevent this and why and how? Because it's usually more than one person. Right?
Yeah.
There's more than one opportunity. And I think that we cannot always make up for harms done, but you can certainly commit to reform in a way that's not just, I won't do that particular bad thing, but what are all the things that make research good? You know, we often don't focus enough on when research goes well and looking at good models. And I think that's another very important part of teaching and learning research ethics is to look at the good. You know, what are the good ways of doing things? And so I enjoy spending time with that too.
It's kind of a way of honoring our participants. I mean, even if they weren't wronged and everything in the study went really well, we focus on those good studies. There's still the numbers that we're reporting in our papers. They're the people that we're basing sometimes policy on. So it's important to make sure that they are respected in that way. Anything else that either one of you would like to say before we end?
Learning well from mistakes that have been made. And just to give a contemporary example that we're all very well aware of, that is spurring a great deal of change globally, and that is He Jiankhui's creation of Crispered babies, which is exactly the kind of question, it fits Anna's question perfectly of who was in a position to stop this and why, and what happened along the way. And there are plenty of stories of this young Chinese scientist who decided to make a name for himself, and a lot of conflict about who he told what he was doing or what he was planning, and who acted and who didn't act, until everything, got up to the point where two babies were born who may or may not have actually had their genes altered by CRISPR. It's not really clear whether it worked or not. But the result has been a lot of global thinking about the kind of research enterprise that we should collectively have, so that one country can't do something that no other country will choose to do. And a lot of thinking, careful thinking and more careful thinking needed about how to proceed with an extremely potentially promising, but also extremely controversial and not very well understood line of research, which gets right back to this notion that we have to talk together, that we have to recognize that reasonable minds can differ, and that we have to exercise moral imagination to come to a point where we can figure out how to move forward in some areas that everybody wants to move really fast, but that we also have to exercise prudence and caution about.
Anna, anything to wrap up?
Not at all. I think those were great thoughts to end on, Nancy. Thank you.
Yeah, I could talk to the both of you all day, but I know you're busy ladies. So my final question is always, what's your hobby? I know both of you have been on here before, but remind me, what is your favorite hobby?
I read science fiction, and I actually read a book that I just decided next time Anna and I are physically in the same place, I'm going to pass this along to you, Anna. It's a book about pharma and research ethics.
Great.
And it's rather badly written in an entertaining sort of a way, but the points that it makes about research are absolutely true.
Wow.
Great.
I'd be interested in that too. Yeah.
I will look forward to it. I also enjoy reading. I don't read nearly as much science fiction. I love reading historical fiction. And I also love being outside in beautiful weather, whether it's here in Winston-Salem, taking a good long walk, or preferably at the beach. And I also really enjoy cooking. I love cooking for a crowd. So the pandemic has been quite an unhappy time because I couldn't cook for crowds. I enjoy having a house full of people.
I enjoy baking. I know you're the cook, but I can't cook. I can bake. Well, thank you both for joining me, and I really appreciate the insights. I think people are going to enjoy seeing this for sure.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, as always.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.